Литература. I want to teach you a little bit about Russian literature. Russian culture considers literature to be very important, and Russians are very well educated in their own literature. So you should know a little bit about some of the most famous authors. There are many more than these, but I've picked out at least some for you to become acquainted with. Here we have a few vocabulary words related to reading. Какое это произведение? The word произведение means work, like work of literature. And here we have some different types of works of literature. A novel is роман. A short novel is повесть. And a short story is рассказ. If you like poetry, then there are several words for poems. Poema means a longer poem or an epic poem, whereas a shorter poem is стихотворение or maybe стихи. Стихи can also refer to just a few lines of poetry. A play is пьеса. If you like prose, we have проза. Or if you prefer poetry, поэзия. And then we have several words for the people who write literature. Автор, писатель, прозаик, поэт. Что вы любите читать? So what do you like to read? Я люблю читать романы, повести, рассказы, поэмы, стихотворения, стихи, пьесы, прозу, поэзию. The most important Russian writer is Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. He lived in the 19th century, and he's considered very important partly because he's thought to have created the literary Russian language. So if you read Russian writing before Pushkin, it's a lot different. But Pushkin influenced the language such that it has stayed a lot more consistent since then. Pushkin also wrote in many different genres, and many of the writers that came after him were very much influenced by him. He's considered the most important Russian writer. He wrote both poetry and prose. I've written the Russian and English names of some of his most famous works here at the bottom. Yevgeny Onegin is his famous novel in verse. Медный всадник is his famous long poem called The Bronze Horseman in English. Kapitanskaya Doshka is one of his more well-known short stories, or it's a longer short story. And then maybe one of his most famous shorter stories is Pikovaya Dama, the Queen of Spades. Perhaps the second most important Russian writer is Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol. Gogol was just a little bit younger than Pushkin, and he was a comic writer. He wrote mostly short stories and basically one novel. His works are very funny, and I really recommend them to you. Some of his most famous works are the short story called Nos, where a man wakes up and his nose has jumped off of his face. The overcoat, shinel in Russian. One of his most famous plays is called Revizor, and it is really very funny. And his famous novel that he didn't finish, Мертвые души, Dead Souls. The most famous in the West, probably, Russian writer is Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. You've probably heard of some of his novels. Преступление и наказание, Crime and Punishment, Idiot, The Idiot, and Братья Karamazovы, The Brothers Karamazov. He has a lot of other interesting and famous works as well. Of course, there's also Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. His most famous novels are Война и мир, War and Peace, and Anna Karenina. There are many other short stories and novels that he's known for. One that he wrote more towards the end of his life is called Смерть Ивана Ильича, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's one of my favorites. Anton Pavlovich Chekhov is known both for his short stories and his plays. In the West, he's more well known for his plays, and in Russia, probably equally for his short stories and his plays. One of his most famous short stories is called Dama s Sobachkai, The Lady with the Lapdog. And then his four most famous plays and four main plays, I think he has just maybe one other full-length play, are called Chaika, Seagull, Дядя Ваня, Три сестры, and Вишневый сад. Anna Andreevna Akhmatova is not as well known in the West, partly because she's a poet. She wrote in the beginning of the 20th century, for the most part, but she also wrote through the 20th century. She is mostly known for her very personal, shorter poems, but she has a couple of longer poems that are famous, like Requiem and Poema без героя. Boris Leonidovich Pasternak is most well known in the West for having written Dr. Zhivago, the novel that was banned by the Soviet censor. But in Russia, he's more well known for his poetry. One of his most famous collections of poems is called Sestra moya жизнь. Pasternak was also well known for his translations of other literatures into Russian, including Shakespeare. Iosif Alexandrovich Brodsky is a more recent poet. He lived in the United States for a long time and actually was a professor at the University of Michigan for a while. He's mostly known for his poetry, but he also, interestingly, wrote in English. And one of his memoirs that was written in English is called In a Room and a Half. It's a very, very interesting work. Alexander Isaievich Solzhenitsyn. You might know him because he was one of the most famous writers who wrote about the gulags, the labor camps in the Soviet Union. And his short novel called Один день Ивана Денисовича, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was very famous for being the first work of literature in the Soviet Union that was allowed to be published about the labor camps. And I find it a very touching story. He's also very well known for his work called Gulag Archipelago, the Gulag Archipelago, which is kind of half fiction and half history, again about the labor camps. Viktor Olegovich Pelevin is a writer who is still writing, and he's relatively young. He was born in the 1960s, I think. He is still very popular, and he's somewhat unusual in that he's both popular and critically acclaimed. He has many novels, but two of his earlier ones are called Жизнь насекомых and Generation P. There are many more Russian writers, and I hope you'll consider taking some Russian literature classes that we offer at Michigan State. There are so many things to discover in Russian literature.